Status booster, go. GNC, go. Go and throttle up, Capcom.
For decades, we've been asking for Konnor Rogers to come on Remote Ruby. And we've been met with silence. We've been met with, that sounds good, one day. We've been met with tweets, but we've not been met with Konnor's presence.
That's one small step for man.
And that changes today.
Oh, yeah.
One giant leap for mankind.
So, welcome, Konnor Rogers, to Remote Ruby.
Nice to finally be here. It's an honor to be here.
It's going to be fun. I spent this week trying to remove things from my list to talk to you about because I feel like you have so much interesting things to share with us, so much insight to give us, and all I want to do is learn.
It's funny you say that you had a checklist for this because when I went on the Ruby on Rails podcast with Brittany Martin, I got an actual checklist a week prior of like, here's what we're going to talk about, here's everything. And with this, I scheduled it on the calendar probably like a month ago, and I got silence, nothing. All I got was an hour before this. It was like, hey, you have a meeting in an hour. I was like, cool, Remote Ruby, here we go. And I was like, I wonder if they even know I'm showing up, if they're just going to hop on the call and I'm going to be like, hey, guys, what's up? Or what's going to happen? And sure enough, hopped on the call. Hey, guys, what's up? Let's do this.
This is the vibe.
I feel kind of called out. Hold on.
I'm here for the vibe, honestly, you know?
He's not wrong. That's the way it is.
He's not wrong. Oh my God. I have talked about in the past, like this idea of doing that because I went on Brittany's show and I was like, oh my God, you do this so good. You're so good at this. We should do this. But here we are.
Yeah.
So
okay.
welcome.
I love you to death.
Do it.
I'm struggling to imagine a world where you're like, you know what? I'm going to sit down, write this out, send this to our guest.
Well, that's why it hasn't happened.
I am the same way. I can't do that. I just fly by the seat of my pants and whatever happens, happens. There is no forethought to it. Just whatever comes and make it all happen.
I'm lucky if my Adderall has kicked in before 2:00 when we record this.
I'm lucky if it kicks in at all for me.
Yeah. We were sans Chris today. He's on his mini trip. And when I say mini trip, you may think, oh, he's taking a quick trip. No, he is taking a Mini Cooper road trip for 2 weeks or a week and a half. I like to imagine today he started in Indianapolis, he said. I like to imagine today he's almost to Buffalo, maybe in Buffalo, going to Niagara
Where are they
Falls. Well, they're starting in Indianapolis, and then they're going to Buffalo, and then coming down the East Coast. And I think they end in Spartanburg, South Carolina.
What a beautiful place to end as well. I mean, hats off to them for a great final location.
I think there is a like BMW some kind of manufacturing thing there. And there's maybe a racetrack.
Oh, okay. I grew up in North Carolina. I've a lot of family in South Carolina. No shade. I'm just saying there's not a ton of Spartanburg.
I bet no shade.
I'm still stuck on this idea of going on a road trip in a Mini Cooper. I'm picturing like Chris and Brooke up front and then like National Lampoon style have the suitcases like strapped to the top of the Mini Cooper.
Yeah. Kudos to my good friend Brooke Oliver, who is pregnant in a Mini Cooper on the road for a week and a half. Oh my God, bless her soul. In a Mini too. Like if you can get me in the car for 2 hours under certain circumstances and that's it. You're going to hate me if it's more than that. I've been in a car with you for about 35 minutes and
yeah, I know.
And I watched a trucker try to effectively end our lives because of something you did that I still don't know what you did, but
I consider myself to be a good driver. I'm a very defensive driver. I have a sports car. I don't drive it like one. I don't know what that trucker was on about, but middle fingers to him.
I consider you to be defensive, so that checks out.
Okay. You know what? I'm getting defensive. Let's move on.
Oh, sweet.
All right. Konnor, how did we meet? Because I feel like I've known you for a long time on the internet. And I have no idea how that first started.
All right. So I had been doing coding for like 2.5 years. I'd been listening to a Ruby on Rails podcast the whole time, back when it was Kyle Daigle originally. And then it swapped over to Brittany Martin, and I continued listening. And I heard you come on, had to have been like sometime around October of 2019, because that's when I made my Twitter account. I made my Twitter account because Andrew went on Brittany's podcast and was like, listen, if you're a new dev trying to get a job, network, get out there, find other developers, just annoy other people in this sphere. And I'm like, cool, I'll do that. Made my Twitter account. So sometime around October 2019 is when I first learned of you. I don't think I started joining Discords until like March of 2020, right around COVID time. And I think that's how we met, was through Stimulus Reflex Discord. Either that or it was Twitter. I don't know which. It was one of those two. I don't remember. Timelines are all messed up, but something along those lines.
I thought it was Stimulus Reflex. I don't know if I feel good or bad about getting you on Twitter, but if anyone has ever followed that motto that I gave out there, and I've stuck to that kind of thing of like, that's how you can market yourself. You have done it the best out of anyone I've ever seen. And you're helpful on Twitter. I remember you in Stimulus Reflex a little bit, but I really remember us working on a bunch of Bridgetown stuff together, I think. We barely gave you an intro. I was just like, how do we even meet? How did this even start? But yeah, so when I met you, you were an EMT trying to get into tech. And now here we are, and you made it, dude. Congrats.
So I was in EMT for 3 years. By the time I got my first job as a full-time software developer, I'd been a paramedic for 4 years. So in total, I'd been doing EMS for 7 years. And I also was in the Army Reserves during that whole time for 8 years. And I have no degree. I took 2 semesters of community college towards a nursing degree that I dropped to go become a paramedic. And I was at work one day, and I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I just was like, I want to code. And I spent the next 3 years just constantly building and listening to podcasts and just, totally putting myself in that entire realm of what does it take to get here. And that's kind of my background story. What also isn't there is, at the time I learned to code, I had a 1-year-old at home. My wife and I had our second kid a year and a half later. So I have a 3-year-old and 6-year-old now. So I also had a job change in the middle of that. So there was a lot, but in the end, it took me almost 3.5 years to get my first dev job to where I am now.
And I think it's important to also mention what you're doing these days, because it's going to be relevant to some of the conversation we want to have later on too.
I guess that's important too. So my first job, a lot of the older Ruby on Rails people will know him. My first job was actually working for Hampton Catlin. He's actually creator of Haml. I know how much we love Haml on this podcast. And that was my first job. And I was working with him at a startup called Vue. And we were basically doing live streaming. By the end of it, we had 500 ms delays on live streams. So from the time you hit record to the time it got out there, 500 ms, but we unfortunately ended up shutting down. And I had somebody reach out to me, Corey LaVisca, the creator of Shoelace, was like, hey, we have this opening at Microsoft. Would you be interested? Because I'd been doing some web component work. And now I work on an internal design system called Harmony at Microsoft. And that is my full-time job right now.
I'm so proud of you because we're around the same age. You always inspired me as someone who just freaking builds and builds and builds. Just from where you were when we first met to now, I feel so much joy in my heart to see that.
For reference of age, I will be 27 in October.
You're a few months older than me.
I know you said everyone with kids is at least 40. So, I had to set the record straight.
Yes.
That not all of us are.
I did know that you were my age. Yes, I did.
Oh, really?
Although in my brain, because I met him before I knew he had kids. We have never spoken until this exact moment. We've been talking in Discords and Twitter and everywhere else for 2 years at least. We've never spoken until this exact moment.
This is our first call together.
That's really cool.
And you're here for it, Jason.
I'm here for it.
Speaking of collaboration as well, I think this goes well into what you guys are probably going to want to ask me about. So Andrew had mentioned previously about Bridgetown, and that's how he kind of met me. So Andrew introduced me to this project at the time. I was still working as a paramedic. It's called Snowpack, which is a bundleless bundler. And this was where my journey kind of took off, was with Snowpack. So Andrew had mentioned it. I took it and just ran with it. So Snowpack was this bundleless bundler created by the team that now makes Astro.build and Skypack and all these other things. And so what happened was Snowpack was very new in its emergence onto the scene, and I got very interested in it, and I wanted to learn everything I could about it because I really liked the project. It was a nice alternative to Webpack. I was a new dev at the time. I'd had my struggles with Webpacker and everything, so I was like, this could be really cool. So I dove deep onto Snowpack, bundlers, and I made some Snowpack plugins. At the time, I made a plugin that was called Snowpack Rollup Plugin Bundle, something like that, something along those lines. And basically what it did was, in development, you had the Snowpack setup, which was using ES-Build under the hood for your JavaScript. Then in production, what it would do is it would use a rollup config to minify everything. It would do scope hoisting, bundle optimizations. It'd do all these things for you under the hood. And it'd build a manifest for you. Like, this plugin was pretty massive because at the time there wasn't anything like it. Fast forward probably about 4 or 5 months after I built that plugin, Vite was announced, Vite version 2 by Evan Yu, that everyone knows about now. Guess what Vite does? It is ES-Build in development, and then in production, it minifies, scope hoists. It does all these things for you. It builds out a manifest for you for backend integration, which I actually raised that issue on the Vite repo, and that's how that came to be. So it's kind of funny to see this come about after I had like an initial prototype that was very much the same thing. And it was just really cool. And I shared all the work all along the way. I even had talks with like Fred. Fred's the, I don't know if he's CEO, founder, whatever the case may be, of Snowpack, Skypack, all those technologies, Astro.build. And that's what really got my foot in the door and got me noticed, was all the attention I paid to bundlers and just being generally helpful in the Stimulus Reflex Discord to answering people's Webpacker woes. Because the only way to help people migrate to a new technology from Webpacker or Webpack to Snowpack is to know about the old technology. So I had to learn everything there was to know about Webpack before I could be like, hey, this is why Snowpack is better. And that's why a lot of people know me for bundlers.
And you have just lobbed me a softball, my friend.
Oh, yeah. The title is so easy now. Go ahead, Jason.
So my literal project at work right now, we won't call it removing Webpacker. We'll call it speeding up production builds.
With Docker.
You think we're going to have to remove Webpacker? So obviously ES-Build is very popular right now. Vite is also very popular. Just this past 2 weeks, Laravel, which if you're listening to the show, you may have heard about before, has switched from using Webpack to Vite. They used to have kind of their own API around Webpack. And another one that's interesting to me, Parcel. I read a thing on Parcel 2 like a year ago, and it really piqued my interest in it. And then the other thing that is in consideration, but is kind of at the end of the consideration list right now, is the successor of Webpacker, the Shaka Packer. And so basically, I'm just going to lay out for you what we're looking at and just kind of get your input, because I'm interested in, you're going to spin up a Rails project. What are you going to choose? Does it matter on like the type of work you're doing? That's where I want to go.
I will answer that in 1 second. So while we're on the topic of JavaScript and bundling, did you hear about the new JavaScript runtime that was just announced called Bun?
No.
Another one.
So Bun is a little different. So it aims to be like what Rome said it would be, right? It handles bundling. It handles the runtime for you. It's written in Zig. It's super fast. Like, it's this brand new JavaScript runtime that uses JavaScript core under the hood, which is what WebKit uses under the hood. So it's crazy fast. The creator is Jared Subner. It's a super cool project, very new. handles transpilation for you. So you get like JSX, TypeScript, TSX out of the box, all that. It's this awesome new framework. I haven't played with it yet because it was just announced yesterday, but I thought it was cool to talk about. Back to the original question, now that JavaScript, there's always a new runtime, new framework coming out. For most projects, when I spin up a Rails app, I'm going with Vite Rails right now. And I'm going to butcher this name. It's by Massimo Mussini. And it aimed what I wanted to do with an old project I have called Snowpacker. It does everything I wanted to do, and I didn't have to build and maintain it. So that's my go-to these days is Vite Rails. I think it's actually renamed to Vite Ruby now and has a plugin for Rails. But that's my personal go-to for most projects. Now, are there times where I'm okay with import maps? Sure. But for the most part, I stick with Vite because I like it, I know it, and I enjoy using it. The dev experience, I enjoy it. There is the downside, and people will say this as well, that because it is using ES-Build in development and in production, it is using rollup, you do technically have two different environments going. That is true. And yes, occasionally it does cause problems. I'd say for 99% of use cases, you're going to be fine. But it does present its challenges. Like you can't just write it off and say that it's not a thing. But that's a challenge with most of these bundles. Like Webpacker, as you see it today, does a similar thing, right? It gives you like cached versions of things. And some people even do differential bundling for production. So like they may target ES5 in production, but in development, they may be using like ES6. Like I said, it's one of those things. It's not wrong to point it out, but these bundlers are very good these days and they're very backwards compatible. So if that was my only hang up, I wouldn't use that as a reason not to use it.
The specific Vite Ruby project you're talking about is what I've considered. So if you go to like ES-Build's website, right, on the landing page, it like shows you benchmarks and it's clever. It's good. It actually makes you sit there for 30 seconds while like the other ones fill out and it's like, I'm already done. That is interesting to me, but it concerns me a little bit because I'm not sure that ES-Build by itself does everything that we're currently getting like with Webpacker. I'm aware there's plugins, but I'm unsure if I should really like dig in and push down the ES-Build route, or should I try out something like Vite that uses rollup, but then I see that homepage where rollup takes 30 seconds. What are your thoughts on that?
I forgot to mention this earlier, but Webpacker under the hood is just a bunch of Webpack plugins as well. It's not just Webpack that is Webpacker. It's filled with plugins like Post CSS Loader and CSS Loader and all this other stuff. So like either way, I forgot to mention that earlier and I just want to call that out. Sorry, Konnor, go ahead.
Andrew's 100% right. So it's important to distinguish the two. There's Webpack, the actual like project that does all the bundling. Then there's Webpacker, which is the Rails abstraction that is like, hey, we gave you this pre-configured Webpack config for you. We have all the loaders set up for you and everything. So that's the first part of making that distinction. If you look under the hood at the Webpacker source code, it has an auto loader that detects if you have certain loaders installed in your NPM dependencies and will auto load those up for you. So there's like a lot of magic under the hood, right? Typical Rails. We have a lot of magic going on. But yeah, Webpack by itself doesn't really do much. Webpack by itself only transpiles JavaScript. That's it. Like that's the basic of it. And then you start adding in your CSS loaders. You start adding in your Sass loaders, your post CSS loaders. You have your CSS extract loaders that will pull out a CSS style sheet for you. Like there's a lot that goes into these that you just don't see with Webpacker because it's all abstracted away. So Andrew's point is very valid that Webpack by itself really doesn't do much, but the plugin ecosystem is what you're really leveraging when you're using Webpacker. As for ES-Build, part of why it's so fast is it's built in Go, right? It's not even built in JavaScript. So that's the first reason why it's fast. Those numbers can be very deceiving though, because ES-Build only handles JavaScript. So Partial is a good example because Partial handles everything for you. It's the exact opposite of ES-Build. So when I import, let's say, a PNG file, imports are native to the browser. If I import a PNG file in the browser is going to laugh at me and be like, you can't do that. That's not part of the spec. The spec says you can only import JavaScript files. That's partially changing. They're working on other things. But as of today, you can only import JavaScript files inside in an import statement. Now, what these other things like Webpack, Vite, and all this and Partial do is when you import a PNG, for example, PNG is easy. What it does is under the hood, it transforms that into a JavaScript object that will then give you a source path to its final path. And that's what it gives you in the end. Is it's like, if I import a PNG and then I reference that inside a JavaScript file, it's going to give me the final path of that image. And so that's where ESBuild has gotten away with a lot, in that there's two for sure ways. I forget if there's a third way. There's two ways you handle external assets, is what they call them, right? Anything that's not JavaScript is an external asset. So for a PNG, you can either use a file loader, which would be like, hey, just hash this file, throw it off somewhere into the build directory. We're not going to touch it. And then there's the other option of data URLs, where it like inlines it as a data URL. But a lot of the reason why it's so fast is because it skips a lot of the stuff a lot of other transpilers do. Parcel and stuff, they have like all this like native handling of PNGs, WAFs for fonts, like everything. It does everything you could ever imagine, right? And so that's where ESBuild kind of really is able to show its numbers, because it's not doing as much. If you look in the fine print, it's not as big of a deal today, but ESBuild will not let you, well, you can try to transpile down to ES5. It's kind of like experimental, but anything below ES5 is off the table for ESBuild. Like, it's not going to support back to ES3. So if you have like some old site that needs to support like IE9 or something wild, like ESBuild is not for you. So there are some things to consider there where it's not as robust as some of the other things, but it is very fast. Let's not discount it either. It's very fast. It's a good project. And Evan, the creator of it, has done fantastic work over there and has really like inspired a lot of people to keep building their own bundlers or to leverage it. So I think it's been a huge win for the ecosystem. And I'm not trying to knock ESBuild, because it is a great project. I think more than anything, it's a lot more low level than some of the other projects, right? Like, it doesn't give you a dev server out of the box. ESBuild is very much comparable to Rollup. It does one thing, it does it well. It bundles for you, right? It doesn't do like Parcel or Vite, where it has a dev server set up for you in the background that does like hot module reloading and all these other crazy things. It's purely focused on how do we build the most efficient bundles possible.
That makes a lot of sense. And that kind of brings up another question for me, which is that a lot of the reason we adopted Webpacker was to opt into like using ES6, for example, right? And with the full death of Internet Explorer and most people using some type of modern browser that kind of keeps itself up to date, how important is it like to target ES5?
I mean, I work at Microsoft. We don't even support IE11. IE11 is officially gone. I personally wouldn't target ES5. Jason Miller, creator of the Preact project, he shows a bunch of examples of like and even the Babel site will show you like the difference between compiling the ES6 versus ES5. The only reason for ES5 was if you were supporting IE11. And now that that's gone, I see no reason to support ES5, be done with it, and ship smaller bundles, because the difference was literally like 75%. It was a wild amount of JavaScript that you save by not having to transpile down to ES5.
Hi, my name is Andrew Mason, and I'd like to tell you about Honeybadger. Whether USES1 is down or you forget to add a configuration file, everyone has an outage from time to time. When your next outage occurs, transparency is critical. The difference between a minor annoyance that people soon forget and a fiasco that creates sustained resentment is how you communicate. That's why you need Honeybadger. Honeybadger is a crucial component of your incident response plan with their uptime monitoring service that now has an exciting new feature, public status pages. Create a new status page with custom domains, branding, and more. Don't let Twitter be the only way your users can find out if your app's down. Sign up for Honeybadger to improve your incident response with a shiny new status page that you'll be proud to show users. Visit honeybadger.io and start giving your users a better experience today. Let them know that Remote Ruby and specifically Andrew Mason sent you. I started testing out ESBuild on one of our pack files. I just started pushing it through ESBuild to see if I can get it to bundle. And the file thing was interesting because typically when I've run into that with Webpacker or even lower level Webpack, if it's not covered by Webpacker, then you have to add a loader. But really, like you said, all I kind of cared about was if it's a PNG, I just need it to point to the PNG. That's fine. And with ESBuild, it was pretty simple. It was like there's a loader argument to the config, and you just give it the extension and tell it it's a file, and it just builds out the file. And I think that's a big part of it for us. The other two things that I have in mind, the first one I'll start with is we're not like a React shop, but we do have several things running React. Like our storefronts, the page sections themselves are each like a React component. And so I look at something like Parcel that's like, hey, we're configured for React out of the box. And that's appealing to me. With ESBuild, I do see it has like JSX support, and maybe that's good enough because we have all the React dependencies already from using it on Webpack. Maybe that's good enough. Like maybe I can just run that through ESBuild, but it is something I'm considering as I look at these tools.
Yeah. So Parcel, ESBuild, there's another one written in Rust called SWC. Don't ask me what it stands for. That's what Parcel uses under the hood is SWC. And that one aims to be more of a Babel competitor than ESBuild. Anyway, they're all going to handle React pretty well. They all have the JSX transpilers built in. Like you're going to be fine on that end. Where I feel like most people run into issues with the transition is if they have a lot of custom Webpack config. Like if you're stuck to like basic Webpacker and you don't have any fancy like common JS transpilation going on, nothing too like out of the box that you wouldn't expect, you should be fine to go to ESBuild, Parcel, whatever the case may be. Like it's more so when people have these very complex Webpack setups that they hit issues going to ESBuild because it's not as fully featured as something like a V or a Parcel. And that's where I found that most people hit roadblocks. It was if they had some bizarre dependency that didn't work nicely with ES modules, so it like just totally broke everything. But if you have a pretty small dependency stack, if things are pretty lean, I'd say for probably 95% of use cases, ESBuild will get you there. I don't see a reason why you would need anything beyond that for most people. Like I said, there are some people who do have that one legacy dependency, one or two legacy dependencies that are just fully hampering them and they can't move off them.
That makes sense. I was concerned about ESBuild because I am not necessarily wanting to end up doing a lot of configuration, and that's why something like Parcel specifically appeals to me. But I feel like I am 20 minutes away from getting ESBuild to compile or to bundle one of my pack files. And if that's the case, I'm willing to push on it more. One thing that came up when we were talking about this in the team earlier, though, is the idea of maybe splitting out CSS because we use Sass, we use Bootstrap for a lot of our like CMS stuff, and maybe actually splitting out the CSS part of things to be a separate process and letting a bundler just bundle JavaScript. And that's my last question on the subject before we get on to web components, but I'm curious your thoughts here.
If you look at the current state of JavaScript bundling for Rails, they actually take the approach you're talking about, right? ESBuild just bundles the JavaScript, and then CSS is handled by a separate build script for your CSS. And that's because Sass plus ESBuild compatibility, it's there, but it's not great. It's one of those things, because it wasn't built with it in mind, it's kind of just like tacked onto it. I think that is the best approach, is to have a separate process for it, because that's the current approach that Rails is taking with it. JavaScript bundles JavaScript, CSS bundles JavaScript, and they can talk at the end, but they don't need to know about each other while you're bundling. And this is one of those cases, again, where ESBuild isn't as fully featured, right? Like V in Parcel will have post CSS Sass support out of the box for you. Whereas, ESBuild, it's, a lot more like, you're taping things together.
Yeah. And something to note, kind of going back to what you're talking about, like advanced, like Webpack configs. When it comes to CSS and Sass, we're not doing anything outside of just writing Sass. Like, I don't foresee an issue why we couldn't just run it through like Dart Sass. The other thing about the Webpack config is we used to have not a super custom config, but we did have to extend it for a while because we ran our UI library as a separate package. And so in order to reference that package without having to go like 50, it's an exaggeration, but like, 5 or 6 folders deep when you're importing it, like we alias that stuff. So what we've actually ended up doing right now to try and help with this transition to some kind of new build tools actually brought the UI package back into just the mono repo. And I think this is very helpful. And I appreciate you sharing a lot of this because there's a lot of tools out there right now. And somebody commented earlier in our work call, they all claim to be the fastest build tool. And it's kind of exhausting. So I just want something that's dependable and faster than what we have now, because it takes almost 6 minutes to bundle our assets for production.
That's a lot. I can't say for certain because I haven't looked at the app, but I want to believe you should be able to get to work with ES Build. It may be a little bit more work than like a V or a Parcel or something, but you should be able to get it to work. I don't remember if ES Build supports path aliases. I know TypeScript does if you bundle with ES Build and TypeScript, because it kind of like goes through that chain, but I don't remember if ES Build supports path aliases. But yeah, that is one of those tricky configuration spots you can get into, is when you do use those path aliases and you lean on them heavily, they become harder to unravel as you try and change. And that is definitely one of those important issues to be aware of.
What we ended up doing to prepare for it was we just updated it to all be apps like absolute paths to the files. The other thing that is selfish for me, the reason we did that is because like VS Code is much better at being like, oh, I noticed this file moved or was renamed, and it'll just like update it for you if it can actually follow it. And I'm sure there's some kind of way to make that work with like Webpack or stuff, but I don't have time.
Yeah,
for that.
So you would actually have to set that up. If it's a plain JavaScript file, you'd have to set it up in a JS config at the root of the project is how you would do that. And that's how you get path aliases supported inside of VS Code. While we're talking about path aliases, I think it is also important to talk about the elephant in the room, import maps, because we haven't spoken to those. We just skip right over those, right? Which most people seem to do.
Yeah, they're not really an option for us at Podia, but they are an option for a lot of people starting side projects right now.
I'm not interested in them. Changed my mind.
I'm not going to. I can't.
I feel so much more validated now. Good.
I can't in good faith recommend import maps for any project that has either a significant amount of JavaScript or needs some kind of translation like React. And it gets even deeper than that too, because import maps are still very new. They have no way of doing like deep level dependency resolution. So let's say I'm using the same library in two different spots. And let's say I'm using like version 1 of one library, version 2 of the other. When I use an import map, I can only pick one version. And so import maps are great as a start tool to get you up and going. No node needed. You know, you get the DHH, no node, fantastic. As soon as you step out of that box, though, it's game over. You quickly hit brick walls, and it's just not fleshed out enough. There is a polyfill available for unsupported browsers. Mozilla just shipped import maps, I think, in version 100, I want to say. Chrome has had import map support because it's been championed by Google. And Safari still doesn't have it. So there is a polyfill. There is an issue with the polyfill, though. If you have an error in your JavaScript, due to how the polyfill works, it has to wait for your module loading to error first, and then it catches it and loads it in. If your JavaScript has a syntax error, it just completely blanks it out. Your JavaScript doesn't load in. You're like, why is this broken? I get this normal error that I always get. Why is nothing working? And it's just very much in its infancy. I'm sure if it works out, JH looks like a genius. But right now, I just can't recommend them because they just aren't fleshed out enough. They're not there yet.
Thank you for saying that. I have not had the words to explain those things. Those are the things that I thought were the issues with it. And I have been mocked for my stance on not wanting to use import maps. Not by Jason.
Who mocked you? Who mocked you?
Not you. No, I don't want to say. Not you or Chris. Someone.
It bothers me that someone else is out there doing my job.
Oh, you had me in the first half, not gonna lie. Yeah, I never had like actual science because I was never bothered to like research. But I was like, what about like, what if two things use different version? Or like, what about compression and yada, yada. So yeah, okay. Thank you for finally saying that on the record so I can refer people back to this.
The other side of it too, you just talking about compression. There's no code sharing that happens with them either, right? Like as long as you have the exact dependencies, you can code share those modules. But, you know, if I'm using version 1.1 in this dependency and my other version uses version 1.1.1, they don't share. And now you've imported the same thing twice. And so you're shipping drastically larger bundles that way because you don't get any of, you know, Yarn has what's called resolutions. So you don't have like anything to kind of dedupe these dependencies. So you end up with a lot more bloat. Like I said, it's fine when you have like 2-3 dependencies stacked small, totally fine. As soon as you start moving out of that golden path is when you'll hit issues very quickly, and they'll hit you like a brick wall.
I want to talk about web components because I think, if I'm not mistaken, you're working on web component ishy stuff at Microsoft, right?
Not just web component ishy stuff. My job is actually working on internal design system using web components. Like the entire design system is web components. So think Shoelace, except not out in the open and open source.
There's like this like tiny part of me that loves doing design system work, but there's also a bigger part of me that hates me for liking it. So moving on from that, that's really cool though. I think web components are the future. And I've been getting more and more bullish on them, yet my understanding of them is minimal because like in my mind, I'm like, okay, I understand what CSS variables is unlocked. And we talked a little bit about this pre-show, but in my mind, CSS variables is like one of the biggest pieces to all this because what it allows you to do in combination with like now like logical operators or whatever they're called in CSS, like clamp and calc and all that other functions, maybe CSS, whatever they're called. And HSLA, it's pushing us into like new territory where in the past, this idea of like, oh, I'm going to make a component system and then I'm going to use it everywhere is not actually how it plays out usually for people. Because, and I hear this, especially from Rails developers who are just kind of taking their partials and moving them into components, though I have been screaming on this podcast for years not to do that. But it doesn't play out in practice of, okay, I actually can take this component and move it elsewhere. And especially if you're like pulling in someone else's component from something that you don't even control and it's got its own styles, like, oh, I hate these styles. I need to rewrite all these. Now CSS variables, like it's actually attainable. And then this idea of web components was presented to me. And can you just tell the audience what a web component is?
Yeah, so a web component is basically when the browser ships a preset number of HTML elements right now. And what a web component is, it is an upgraded version of a basic HTML element, but it gets prefixed. Well, it doesn't have to be prefixed with the dash, but it should be so that it doesn't collide with any regular HTML element. So basically it is under the hood, what's happening is it gets registered as an HTML unknown element. And then it gets upgraded to whatever element you want it to be. So let's say if I was using lit element, which is like one of the newer web component libraries out there, right? I would do like export class, my component extends lit element. And so then when that runs in the browser, my element goes from being this unknown element to upgrading to the class that I define. So it's a way of providing the browser with elements it may not otherwise have is the best way to describe web components.
I just remember this, and sorry, audience, this is a little aside. Konnor, I don't know if you saw this, but in the newest version of Bridgetown that is in pre-release right now, Jared is actually shipping it with lit render as like something you can just instantly add and start building like lit components with Ruby inside of Bridgetown. No configuration, just works. It's blowing my mind. But I guess my question there is like, what do I do with a web component? So like I have lit. Now what? Now I'm lit. I want to get more lit. How do I even start? Like what would I even use the web component for?
So first place you would start is lit.dev. It's their fantastic website about, how to use their library for building web components. The next thing I would do is find a use case for them, right? I started off back when I was working for Hampton, trying to build web components that were attached to forms. And forms are really hard, in case you're curious, especially building custom elements for forms. So I would not start there. Where I would start is build a simple widget. I remember there was an example of someone like generating avatars or small little widgets, I think are great places to start. Think of where you would have nested stimulus controllers, or you have like stimulus controllers with like 20 options that, you need everything to be configured a certain way. Anything that relies on a very specific HTML structure under the hood, I would start there. I would start with things that are fairly tightly scoped, things that have been a pain for you to get right. You're doing, data dash controller like 3 levels deep. That's where I would start. I would start very simple, but also start where you have a pain and you need to build something.
it's like, what is my use case? So I guess that's a pretty good example though of really nested controllers or all this kind of really complicated layout stuff that's like attached with its own JavaScript too. I think that's like the key. They kind of shifts with that all in one thing. Like you get the element and the attached JavaScript functionality.
And you also get CSS styles attached to it too. So like, let's say you have this thing in two spots, right? You have your stimulus controller, and then you also need like some CSS to do like an animation on it. With the web component, you can put those all together. They all live in one spot, neatly packaged together, and you don't need to have it living in 3 separate files.
And so once you realize these components exist, I think like the real power is like watching people building design systems with them. You talked about them being like, start small. And I think that's what they're kind of supposed to be, right? Or like when I see them out in the wild, I'm like, this is like ideal. I want to use the web share API, but I'm lazy and I don't want to write JavaScript. So I just want to pull in a web component that will interact with the web share API, handle like the problem of like Firefox doesn't support it and automatically redirect to Twitter or something like that. And so I just install this package and add this custom element and it's just there. And then I can style it if I want to. And I find this very, very powerful. How can we as Rails developers start like kind of taking advantage of this? Or is this something that we should like kind of continue to watch?
I think it depends on how bullish you are. I think for a lot of people, it's something that you should watch. I think it's something you should watch and be aware of. I don't know if they're for everyone because it does take some learning. There is a little bit of a learning curve to it, but once you're there, you're good to go. And, you know, I think it's important to pull in ones and twosies, you know, use small little widgets. You don't need to start with like a full on design system like Shoelace. You can start small. I mean, your tricks editor is actually a custom element under the hood. So like the tricks text editor actually is using the custom elements API. It's a little different because it's not using Shadow DOM and it's not using any other advanced features, but that's where it is. In fact, on the topic, I actually just made a tip-tap web component that is meant to mimic tricks, and I just released it the other day as like a demo. I haven't released the actual like source code and package because that's still a mess, but there's a lot of use cases for it in situations like that where you have this tightly coupled CSS JavaScript that you need all to interact together. And you're probably using more than you know. A lot of dev tools are built with web components. Like your Google Chrome dev tools have web components in them. And they're in a lot more places than you would think. I think the last number I heard was like 18% of websites ship a web component of some kind. And it's pretty big numbers. There's more to them. Like we can get into like Shadow DOM and all these other things. But I think for most people, they don't really care about that stuff because as much as that gives scope styles and everything, I think a lot of people just want something they can drop in and it just works. And I think that is the big selling point of a lot of custom elements is you drop it in, it just works. You don't need to worry about what's going on under the hood. You tweak a couple styles and CSS variables, like you said, and you're good to go. And I think that is the big selling point of them is they give you this encapsulated styling with pre-built JavaScript, and it's meant to just work for you, right? You don't need to worry about implementation details or anything. It's just drop it in and go.
Another user of web components that we're all familiar with is GitHub. They have several web components. I'm just looking at a list of time elements, text expander, task list, markdown toolbar, image cropping, emojis, file attachment, details menu, clipboard copy. Oh, I actually might need that. So it's like all this stuff, they are being used, but I feel like when it's discussed, it's still like, this is still very experimental, like only like cutting edge people are using this. But that's not really true.
Not really true. A lot of people are using it and it's built into the browser. So it's, you know, gives you that like write once, run anywhere, right? The classic Java slogan, right? That is a big selling point of it though, is like you can use it React, you can use it in Vue, you can use it in Angular, you can use it in Svelte, you can use it wherever. And that's a big selling point of it is you don't need to keep rewriting every time a new framework comes out, right? It's built into the browser, it just works. And that is a big place to start. And you were talking about GitHub. They actually have a package called Catalyst, which is kind of like Stimulus, but it upgrades your element to a web component and attaches behavior to it. So it's pretty cool in that sense. Like I said, those local times that GitHub has, those are pretty cool. The clipboards, like I said, these small little widgets, things that you see everywhere that you don't want to have to write multiple times, you know, like you just want to write it once, forget about it, and just drop it in when you need it. not everyone needs to ship their own custom clipboard. Like we can all just use common few clipboard components. And I think that those are great starting points. Once you get to design system, it gets a little trickier because you're doing a lot more. But I think the widgets are where web components really stand out right now because they really let you leverage a lot of power and not have your end users think about how it's actually working.
That's kind of how I use them in practice, right? I don't use a ton of them. I'm interested in the design system aspect of it more so, but I mentioned the web share API thing. I did that. Like now there's just a share button and it will use the web share API, like click to copy. Like I wrote it in JavaScript and I'm like, this is stupid. I'm just dropping a quick web component here. And like a few other places like that. Yeah. But for the small, they're very small, but it's just like, I really can't be bothered to like write this JavaScript with all the right, conditions and like, what if the system color is system and it's not light or dark and, and then I got to have an edge case, all this stuff. I just can't be bothered. So yeah, I really love that aspect of web components, especially because unlike other component systems, I can just use it and I can make it look the way I want it to look. And that's a far cry from, I think, the types of things that we're used to like grabbing off a shelf and sticking in our apps. Select 2, for instance. You have to have a whole other package to style it, So I'm just very interested in it, watching it closely and like, okay, I feel like this will be a bigger component in the future and just kind of watching. So it was really cool to see that you kind of joined Microsoft and started working on all that stuff.
So the job I applied for was supposed to be 7 to 8 years of experience, but they were having a hard time finding anyone with web component experience. And so they kind of waived it and were like, we can't find anyone. So the fact you have this experience at all, because everyone they were finding were just straight React devs with like 12 years experience, but none of them knew what web components were. They didn't care. They just wanted to write React. And it's kind of funny. It's basically why I got the job was because I was writing web components. Now, I'm not saying everyone out there needs to go write web components today and you'll get a job at Microsoft. Don't take it that way, but it's important to be aware of some of these new technologies because they can open doors. And for anyone familiar with the jQuery days, web components give you that same thing as jQuery, right? You write it once and it works in all the browsers and you can share it with people. And I've said this too. I feel like these frameworks like React, Vue, and Svelte and all of these, they've set the web back in some ways because people are building their date pickers, they're building their color pickers, they're building all these fancy, hard to build components in React, in Svelte, in Vue. So there's just a lot of developer time wasted on those because they're being built in these framework specific things. How many Angular date pickers have been lost to the sands of time because no one uses Angular JS anymore? Like it's one of those things where we're now getting back to a standard that everyone can use.
I was invited to like a private beta of something where I literally can't remember the name, but you could write, it would literally output a component in every single React, Angular, Vue, web components, even Liquid. So it was just kind of interesting, like the lengths that we're going to try to like, oh, well, you want to use this version or you want to use this, and you want to use that. And here we got to figure out a way to give it to all of you. I do want to highlight though, your point about being on the forefront of these things does put you in a good position to potentially find a job. Like even what you said about Snowpack, you and I went separately, but also somewhat together, so deep into Webpack and Snowpack and just kind of understanding it. You much more than me because I eventually got bored with it. But because of like that experience in my day-to-day job, no, I wasn't reconfiguring our Webpacker config. But I was able to kind of come into companies after that and be like, oh, well, we could just do this one thing here and this would like drop like, this much amount off our Webpack build. And like, we could do this over here. And it is something that a lot of people like kind of shirk as like, oh, the new thing's out, blah, blah, blah. But you don't have to just pick it up and start using it, but you can start learning about it, right? Because it might put you in a position where if you find it enjoyable, that becomes the thing in a year or something. And now you're in a position where you already have experience with it and you're hireable. Like that was what was happening with Stimulus Reflex. When people started to pick up Stimulus Reflex, who are they calling as like, I need an experienced Stimulus Reflex developer. Well, there weren't many of us. So I was getting constantly pinged like, hey, we want you to come write Stimulus Reflex at our Web3 company, or hey, we want you to come write Stimulus Reflex at our, real estate company or, whatever. So I just wanted to harp on that for some people who may be looking for a job or maybe wanting to find a new job, a better job. It's like, think about exploring some of these new things and like seeing how you can leverage that into a really good position for yourself later for being like an expert on something.
Yeah. I mean, this is a junior dev friendly podcast. So, I mean, I do agree that for junior devs, a way to stand out is to be an expert on fairly new and evolving technology. Now, granted, sometimes you can get burned on some newer technology, but even what may not be considered new and bleeding edge may be newer for a lot of people. There's still people out there, companies writing jQuery right now, and they're making good money doing it. And it's one of those things where if you become an expert in something, a newer technology that not a lot of people may be using or a lot of people are looking at using, a lot of people just write during their day job and then they close the laptop, they're done for the day. They don't really tinker on the side. They don't do a lot on the side, and they stagnate, and people stagnate. And a lot of the best ways to get into companies, if you don't always have the experience, is by having experience in something that a lot of people don't have. They may have like 40 people writing React, but maybe they need somebody who's writing web components in my case. And so you just never know what's needed. And so it's always good to know what's out there in case you're seeing something up and coming and you think it'd be something you really want to work with. People always say, find your niche. And I've found my niche a couple times. First, it was with bundlers, and now it's with web components, and who knows what's next. I had Docker in there for a little bit too. So it's one of those things, you don't always have to stick to one thing either. You can expand and evolve and find new things to play around with.
Be curious, I think, is kind of the summation of it. Be curious and it will pay off.
That's pretty much why Hampton hired me for my first job, was because I was curious and I showed a willingness to learn. And that's what a lot of people are looking for.
Yep. Just you showed up, and you were like an example of doing that I was always pointing. I'm like, he shows up. You can see it every day. He's showing up, whether it's in Discord, GitHub issues, he's getting called in to review things on Bridgetown. He's, helping me with some stuff. In everyone's Twitter replies, just showing up constantly. And I was wondering, do you have any other tips for junior developers based on like your kind of journey here?
Yes. Network. It is the only consistent thing I have seen to get people jobs is by networking. And I don't mean networking as like being like, hey, Jason, can you be my mentor? Don't ask people to be your mentor. Let's start there. Become friends with people, hang out in Discord, say hi, introduce yourself, help out with questions, be a friendly face. That is the best way to network with people, because some of those people that you're helping out may end up with a job offer in the next month, And I think more than anything, it's be friendly, be around, be helpful.
I want to say, you talked about it at the very beginning, but part of the reason like I follow most people on Twitter is because they're just around. Konnor, like we didn't know each other, but like you were following me and like commenting on things. It was just fun interacting with you. We just became friends over Twitter. And it's that way for like a lot of people I follow. So I think it's actually really good advice, because like, obviously you don't want to like roll into someone's Twitter, always pestering, or like, you don't want to be annoying. If there's a way to like show your personality or like just contribute to a conversation, it's fun.
I don't know if I've said it on here or if it just exists in like a private recording that I made driving to Arizona, but it's like kind of the summation of several of y'all's points. But I think because I've been kind of talking about these things for a little bit too, it's like, don't ask me to be your mentor. The answer is no. What you can do though, especially kind of what Jason said and what you've also said, is show up, make yourself known to people. And in terms of like replying on Twitter, just show interest. For people who create and build, I think that spark of interest from someone else who sees your vision and they think it's cool, people want to hang out with those people, right? I've talked about Snowpack for like a year. You were the only person that ever tried it. And so we talked constantly about it. It's like just show interest is one great way. And also it's a quality over quantity thing. Don't be a reply guy and don't just be like, cool, like be intentional when you're trying to network. Very much like you said, Colin does a great job of harping on this as well. Do it to make friends. Don't think about it as like, oh, I'm going to network, la-di-da-di-da. Let me send out some LinkedIn messages. Be like, these people are talking about things that I'm interested in, and I want to know more about what they're doing. Start there.
And on that same topic, surround yourself with people who you want to work with, the technology you want to work with. You talked about it. Immerse yourself in the community, whether that's Ruby, JavaScript, Golang, Elixir, whatever the case may be. Immerse yourself in that community. Get to know who the people are, who's around it, where the communities are, and find them. And you're going to be golden.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever said this live, but one idea that I've had in the past was like, if you're like, oh, well, I don't know what to, I can't even contribute. Like, I don't even know how to get started with all of this. It's like, go find some GitHub project that you are using or that you know of or that you like or have interest in. Look through the issues, see if the maintainer, plural or singular, is active. And if they're active and they seem friendly, I think it's totally reasonable. It obviously depends on the size of the project, right? But it seems totally reasonable to me that you could go into an issue and be like, hey, I saw this issue is open. I would love to like get started helping out with this project. And I would love to start working on this. I don't really know where to start. Could you give me some pointers? Would you be interested in like hopping on a Zoom call? All these other things that you can do. You have to gauge out first whether or not that person's even interested in that behavior. You know, some of them are not. Some people like me are. And so if you were to come on one of my repos and be like, I don't even know where to start, but it was a repo that I am actively maintaining and there's an active issue that I haven't solved yet. And someone's like, hey, I would love to help out with this. I would totally get on a Zoom call with them and like go do it together. I mean, that's how Colin and I met. So
that's how I met Jared. I did the same thing. I didn't do the Zoom call, but I hopped on an issue on Bridgetown. I was like, hey, how can I help essentially? And, you know, now me and Jared are good internet friends.
Yeah. I think what you just said is the absolute key that we can probably end on. How can I help? You can't go in it with like, oh, I need to like get something out of this person, because people can suss that out, right? Be helpful, because if someone is willing to accept help, they will take it. And if you're trying to be helpful and you're being genuine and you're not being fake, it's not like apparent that like you're someone out of a boot camp and they're making you do like 100 cold outreaches or whatever their arbitrary numbers are. Be genuine, be yourself, and be helpful.
That's fun that you think we could end it there, because I have something I need to go back to. How much would it cost for me to get the audio file of you talking to your phone on a drive in Arizona?
Not much, but it's like 2 hours at least.
What do you cover?
I talk a lot about like my ideas and thoughts about breaking into tech as a junior. The reason why it stayed on my phone is because I was free flowing, and you know how I think and talk, you know, it kind of just rolls off the dome and it's littered with curse words. So that's why I've never done anything with it, but it kind of just has a bunch of my ideas on, you know, junior development, how to break into tech, and my thoughts about like the community and how certain actors contribute or take away from it.
You took that in a whole different direction.
You want some of the other recordings?
Yes. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, we can talk about that after.
Konnor, absolute pleasure.
100%.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you for coming.
It was a pleasure to be here. I'm glad I finally got to make an appearance.
We are too. Where can people who are unfamiliar with Konnor Rogers find Konnor Rogers?
Pretty much just my Twitter handle. It's my name reversed, so it's Rogers Konnor with a K. I make things difficult. I'm sure it'll be in the show notes. I don't really do much with my GitHub. And Stimulus Reflex Discord and GoRails Discord are the other two big spots you'll always find me hanging around.
Delightful. Well, this has been fun. And Andrew, we will talk again next week, I think. Also, sans Chris.
Cool. Konnor, thank you so much for coming. Good to finally meet you.
Thank you guys again. Nice to meet you all as well.
All right, folks. Bye.